and we shall be doing director number 139.
139 takes us to... this is going to have to be one you're going to have to talk me through, Rob. Toshiaki Toyoda.
That is bizarre. That is really, really bizarre. Because as this is recording, I just did a box set from Third Window Films about movies from Toshiaki Toyoda.
Yes.
And that this comes out now is so weird.
That is crazy.
He's basically the Japanese cult director who's a peer of Sion Sono, who's a peer of Takashi Miike and all that crew, but he never got the international break. Hello, my name is Rob Simpson and welcome to Directors Uncut. With this being the first episode, I have to explain what this podcast is. Directors Uncut is a lottery of sorts, a podcast in which we put filmmakers from all walks of life and all corners of the globe onto a big list that covers everything. Well, let's just run through the Patreon archive, shall we? We've had an episode on John Waters, which was fun. I don't know how you'd explain him. I would say exploitation, but I don't think that quite cuts it. We've had an episode on Mark Duplass, King of Mumblecore, I guess you'd characterise him. We've also had, let's see here, Makoto Shinkai, a legendary anime director, and let's pick another one at random, and Alexandra Aja. And all of these episodes will be coming into the podcast feed later on. These all originally were Patreon exclusives on the Geek Show. Now they'll be coming to the free feed as well as many other episodes too. How we get these names is we use a random number generator and we pick one of these names with a number corresponding to them at random and we talk about them and two of their films. Right, so I've re-recorded this intro because when this episode was originally recorded in the beginning of December, I was full of cold, so I don't say a lot in the upcoming episode, and that is the reason why. So I just want to get in here, do this intro proper, and then hand over to a knackered, dishevelled version of myself from the past. And I have been joined by Graham Williamson, writer at Horrified and the Geek Show, and Robert Edwards, a YouTuber who covers everything Asian cinema that you need to know. So hello you two. Hello guys.
Hi. Hello.
So, how are you two?
I'm fine. I've been doing pretty great recently, largely because, and I think this is the trick, I don't go outside. I think it's kind of overrated and it tends to cause more trouble than it's worth.
Yeah. I think that's definitely been proven lately. might be a positive mindset to have for the future, I think.
We are recording this, listeners, in early December when we have just had the most unbelievable storm over the weekend.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
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 And if it's not that, there's a strain of hell cold that's going around.
Yeah.
Which...
Indeed, yeah, which I have also ducked by being a weird hermit.
I thought I'd duck it, but I still got it.
Toshiaki Toyoda, Graham, Rob. What's our exposure? Where did we hear about him first? I think is the most diplomatic way of wording this.
Well, I don't know if Robert wants to go first with that because I know it's kind of your corner and it's not my corner. I'm standing in the middle of the field.
Yeah, I'll go first. I think that around the time I came into contact with him, really, I wasn't actually aware of who he was. I kind of had seen a few of his films because I was really into kind of, I guess, like delinquent youth films, I think. So the first film I saw was Blue Spring. I was really into Ishii Sogo at the time and his films, and then I kind of saw like Blue Spring get mentioned quite a few times as kind of being like kind of in the same ballpark as that, and I was really into like these films of, yeah, I guess like Japanese youth like rebelling, because we all know like, and I think it even I don't know how true it is because I've never been to school in Japan, but obviously one of the main things we get told so much is how like hard their schooling system is and how like strict it is. So I was really into like these films where it's the complete opposite of that, and just like schools where it's like complete anarchy and stuff. So I kind of watched that, and I wasn't really aware of who he was. And then I saw Porno Star after that, which I think, if no one's seen that, the title makes it sound like it's a lot more...
it's a bit off.
Yeah, I don't know why it has that title either. It kind of doesn't really... To me, there's nothing I can relate in the film to that. But then I saw that, and then I just kind of, as you do, you go onto like IMDb or whatever, Letterboxd, and you click on the director, and I was like, oh, he also did Blue Spring, and then I kind of, from there, I was like, well, I liked both these films. It just kind of ricocheted into exploring the rest of them, and I was quite happy, because it did kind of, I think all of these films kind of have that consistent theme of outsiders and rebelling and going against the kind of strictness of Japan, I think. So I really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
I think my answer will be, if anything, depressingly on brand for the sort of thing I normally say here, which is, I was curating a Letterboxd list called Psychotronic True Crime, and someone pitched Monsters Club to me as a film that was based on a true crime case that I'm sure we will get into when we talk about it. And I thought, all right, that sounded interesting. But I did not explore further from that. I knew the film, but I didn't look particularly into who directed it. I just sort of put it on the list of things that I ought to watch at some point in the future and didn't make it in a special priority. My knowledge of Japanese cinema in general is quite patchy, but I think the films we've watched for this have made me make a few connections that are kind of interesting with what I know about it. But yeah, Toyoda as a name, Toyoda as an author, I hadn't really thought anything about this until we got that extraordinary Third Window collection in just at the end of last year, which you ended up doing 2 reviews for, didn't you, Rob?
Yeah, it was kind of a bit ambitious of me. I thought 6 films, I can do that in about 1,000 words. I think it was 3,500 words. He captured something in me, I guess. I mean, I heard of him not quite as far back as Blue Spring. I think it was around Monsters Club and a little bit before that, maybe Hanging Garden. He's just one of these directors who's always been on the periphery of sort of the big boys of late 90s, 90s cult Japanese cinema. But he's never really had that breakout movie. He's never really... Before Third Window put those movies out on Blu-ray, I can't really recall much of it getting a release over in the West.
No, definitely not.
He's been one that I've been aware of, but never really had the chance to get into.
And that's quite interesting too, isn't it? Because I'm sure Third Window, for any listeners who don't know, is a label that specialises in Japanese cult cinema. And I'm sure for a lot of their audience, Toyoda is a name they're aware of. But for the wider British DVD and Blu-ray market, they will probably be in the same position that I was in, which is that the first time you really hear of this guy, it's a box set, which is quite exciting, really. I wish that happened more often.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting as well. I think the perception we get of Japanese cinema because of the releases that we get, because I know that for example Third Window push Shinya Tsukamoto heavily. That's one of their I think they've released almost everything now, soon to be anyway, that he's done. So we kind of get this image that he's this, and he is, but a really important director and stuff, but he's not even that big in Japan either. We only get the image of what Japanese cinema is based off what we get. Do you know what I mean? So we actually don't see a lot of the really mainstream stuff from Japan. And then we get Third Window bringing over directors like Toyoda and Shinya Tsukamoto and stuff. And it's kind of funny because sometimes I think wow, they just do so many great films over there, and I think that's because we're only seeing the really great films. Well,
the classic example of that is Takeshi Kitano, where I think that the situation might have changed a bit recently, but there was definitely a time where if you mentioned Takeshi Kitano to a Japanese person, they'd be like, what, the chat show host? That guy?
Yeah.
And this idea that he had a whole parallel career making spare existential gangster movies was I mean, it would be like if we found out that Graham Norton was hailed as the new Antonioni in Europe or something. It's just a completely bizarre thing to happen.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So that's one thing I do like about Third Window. They kind of like champion these kind of, even in Japan, like quite underground filmmakers.
It's bizarre to think that people like Tsukamoto are bigger in the West.
Yeah,
really,
it's mad.
Given what he makes, you know, that he's big anywhere, really. Okay, so what film do we want to tackle first? Blue Spring from 2001 or Monsters Club for circa 2011?
We could do this chronologically, particularly since, Robert, you said this was the first one of his.
Yeah, it was, and it was his second film as well. So I think it's quite interesting, like just to see his earlier aspect of his career, I think.
And it's interesting because this is in the period of his career that isn't covered by that Third Window box set. If I'm right,
it's in the first one.
Yeah, and I think didn't they release it separately as well? I think it was the only one like at first they released separately, which I think is why I watched it at the time and I didn't really like put two and two together. Because I remember, I don't know if it got like a DVD release like back in the day, like by itself. I could be wrong.
It might have. It's a movie that it's just been rattling around in my memory for a while. So
yeah, I just always remember like the poster for it. I just remember like seeing that like around quite a bit. So I guess that was one that they championed quite a bit, like back in the day.
As for a synopsis, it's kind of loose in what it's doing. It's essentially a group of high school kids. Around 2001, so we're talking about a Japan which is just coming off the back of a horrific recession. And these kids, well, it's basically an apocalyptic vision of Japan where the down and outers, there's no prospects. And it's just them trying to survive in a very, very rough, very, very violent school in an unnamed, I believe it's unnamed anyway, a part of Japan.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, very loose plot, I think, overall.
Yeah, so what are our feelings on this one?
I think it's one of those films where as soon as it started, like, my thing is style. You know, I like narrative, I like acting, I like scripts, but I think if a film can sucker me with style first, it's something that I really appreciate. And this has this really unchained camera, this kind of Scorsese-ish almost tendency to make the camera just prowl and swoop all along the corridors of these huge, horrible, gone-to-seed, brutalist buildings. And I think even if I didn't find the story engaging, and I did, but even if I didn't, I would have kept watching just because of the incredibly confident way that it uses the camera.
Yeah, I think that's something with Toyoda, I think, overall as well, because specifically with Blue Spring, and then especially in his first film as well with Porn Star, which we were talking about before, there's not always like something where you can clearly say what was the plot or what was like, well, you can't always tell where it's building to in the finale of this, and especially in Blue Spring, like you just don't really know where it's trying to lead you. But it just has this like such a distinct style, and just kind of this, the hook is in the style more than the narrative, and it's kind of like you just want to see where this is going to go stylistically, and you kind of are free from the narrative of it. And I think it's really fitting for this film as well, because like you're dealing with youths that they don't know where they're going, they're disillusioned and stuff, so there's no narrative there either. And I think that style is just so like, yeah, it just keeps you hooked, and it's the thing I love the most about it, really.
It's so nihilistic just on that. There's no belief. There's a scene about midway through where one of the group, I can't remember the names, I'm terrible with names, sorry about that, but the young lad with the glasses.
Yeah.
He has a meeting with what I can only assume is the careers advisor at the school. He says, "You must have some dreams, some ambitions." He says, "Not really. I've got some vague ideas, maybe world peace, stuff like that."
Yeah, I noted this down because I thought that's a great line. I have hopes for world peace and whatever.
Yeah, and then doesn't he do the Ultraman symbol? Like, and then like after it, he says like when he's speaking to his friends something about he wants to be Ultraman or something. But I think that's kind of like interesting as well, because obviously Japan is like a big like pop culture world and everything, and that kind of like the only thing he can hope for and all he knows is a pop culture reference. you know, like the school system's failed him. He doesn't have ambitions, you know, a businessman or anything like that. It's just all he knows is like he just wants to be Ultraman.
Hey, let's not crush the dreams of children who grow up dreaming to be Ultraman. Let's not tell the youth that that's.
I mean,
not
I think he's past the
goal.
age of maybe still wanting to be Ultraman, though, which I think is the problem.
It can have a sense of humour, though. It's a horrible, nihilistic, violent movie, but it just undercuts it.
But then I think what's
dark,
really interesting as well is after he says that, reveals that, spoiler, but afterwards is like a really horrific scene where he kills I assume is his best friend out of the group as well, like for no apparent reason in the toilet, and really quite a jarring scene. I remember that like the first time I saw it, you know, it's a violent school and stuff, but then that scene and like the way he's like smoking the cigarette like covered in blood and stuff, like it just like it really hits you quite like heavy, because there's like throughout the film there's like these little glimmers of hope, the way like they're all interested in like planting the flowers and stuff like this, and they have nice relationships, some of them, and like teaching each other to play guitar. Like there's these moments where like they kind of are wanting to do something, and then like the moment he's actually asked when he wants to, you know, what he wants to do with his life, and then after it he just destroys his whole life by, you know, killing his best friend, and it's kind of like it's so jarring.
And I think one of the things that adds to this feeling of being trapped is the way the film begins with Cujo, you know, already getting to the top of the school's gang system. It's not the standard gangland narrative where you follow someone's rise and fall. They've already risen, and it begins at the moment when they have that sort of, what now feeling, which is, it really helps it feel suffocating.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, even the way that they choose who's in charge of the gang, like that whole thing of just like hanging from the top of the building and like clapping. It's so like,
oh man,
it's just like they literally. It's like, you know, you'd rather kill yourself, try to get to the top of the gang, or kill yourself trying, kind of thing. Like literally embodied in the way that they do it, which I think is so interesting.
One thing I like it a lot, but when you compare how Toyoda uses music in the short film he did last year, Go Seppuku Yourself, or Day of Destruction, where he creates these like slow motion, stunning shots. Nothing happens, but they're absolutely stunning. And when you compare him to how he uses music here, it's a little bit clumsy.
I don't know. I mean, it's more, compared to the film we'll be doing after this, I guess, it's more of a conventional way to use music in a youth-focused drama. But for all that, I still think it worked really well.
It works. It's just stylistically, it's a bit... When you see the finished article of the director, then you go back to the genesis of the director, it's just a little jarring. That's essentially all I was getting at.
I get what you mean. I think it's less sophisticated. It's kind of just like the music's kind of more there, but I feel like it fits in with this style. Like it feels like it's a very punk film, and like the music's very like the music's also aggressive. Like it just like appears and just like it's just there on top of it. Kind of like fits into this vibe of, to me anyway, like this delinquent youth's punk energy, sloppy but sophisticated filmmaking.
Yeah, I think it's that kind of... When I was talking earlier about the previous eras of Japanese cinema, I think the only one that I would venture to say I've connected with properly is that kind of post-60s generation of Oshima and Terayama, where they were doing very sort of rough, subterranean, underground subjects. They were dealing with people on the bottom rung of society, and their films often had that kind of same anger and energy that I see in this. So I found it, like, despite being very far from an expert on Japanese cinema, I found it surprisingly easy to get along with. Yeah,
I'd agree with that, yeah. It's quite like, even though, it's like dealing with, I guess, images that feel like quite unique to Japan and stuff, but even as an outsider, it's like a really easy watch, I think.
Just to mention the music again, I don't think he is actually aware of it. Because there is a scene where, I think it's in the murder scene actually, where his friend is talking to the eventual murderer, and he's just stood there staring, and music is playing.
Yeah.
And it's sort of shot and edited in a way where it implies he's sort of lost in his head, and that music is the way it's been told as a device, really. Which
I'm trying not to compare it to Godard, because I am aware of my tendency to compare everything to Godard. Listeners might not believe this, but I do care about turning into a total parody of myself. But it is a bit like Godard. I'm sorry.
It's also quite surreal. Well, I'm going to say surreal. That might be the wrong word, but when you think of a delinquent movie, this isn't really it.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
In the sense of the person who you think would be the one who's involved in all these altercations, the one who's involved in all these fights and climbs through the gang system or what have you, he's totally disinterested.
Yeah.
He couldn't care less, really. I mean, he's an actor. Names. Let's see. Ryuhei Matsuda, who's a regular contributor to Toyoda's work, and he's always the same, really. He's quite laconic and quite laid back.
It's almost like a social obligation, isn't it, that once you get to this level, well, I guess you've got to be leader of the gang. I mean, what are you going to do? Turn it down? There's no sort of joy in it. It's not a Scarface narrative about, being the gangster who conquers the world. It's just like, I was there, then I guess I've kind of done it.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like it almost picks apart kind of your expectations of what you would expect. But I think to go back slightly as well, when you used the word surreal, I think it is kind of like an accurate word for a lot of his films, because I think what I really like about what he does is he sets up these quite like realistic world, and then there's always these moments of surrealism. Like in Blue Spring, there's a few bits. The one where when he kind of looks up at the school, and it's as if his friend, I can't remember the name, near the climax of the film, has spray painted the whole school black, and it's just kind of that weird shot, and then it disappears, and you realise it's not actually painted black, and then he's been there the whole night and stuff. It's just like a very surreal like moment before his eventual end. And then obviously in his first film, Porno Star, there's that kind of bit with all the blades like just coming from the sky, like out of nowhere, just like raining switchblades. And it's like, other than that, it's been like a really normal, air quotations normal, but like a kind of like somewhat believable film. And then there's just this scene of surrealism, but they kind of work in it. It's not like, oh, that doesn't make sense for this. It does work in his narrative, and I think that's what I really like. There's always one scene that really like sticks out to you and is surreal and kind of stays with you. I think he always manages to get one scene. I think.
Yeah, I really appreciate it when filmmakers do that. It reminds me, there was a lovely quote that Peter Mullen had about one of the films he directed, Ned's, where he said his direction to the actors is you should be a couple of inches above realism, but not so high that the critics give you a beating, which I saw a certain kinship, with that attitude in this.
It does remind me of a certain scene from a David Lynch movie. I mean, I imagine Graham, being the Lynch head, would be able to point me in the right movie here, but when the conflict in the movie is between somebody who's disinterested in the gang life and his underling who's very much for the gang life, and the conflict arises there with the underling who's sort of pro-gang, kind of goes nuts and ends up colouring himself in.
Oh, yeah.
That's the best way to describe it, really.
It's Wild at Heart, isn't it? It's the Cheryl Ladd character in Wild at Heart who just paints herself with lipstick when she has a breakdown. Yeah, that's a good pull. Yeah.
Whether it was intentional, I don't know, but he seems like somebody who knows his cinema, given his style and his leanings.
Yeah, I think there's another parallel to it, actually, but I might get onto that in Monsters Club, because it's... having seen precisely 2 of Toyoda's films, I'm now, like, totally an expert, and I can back up his running themes. I'm definitely good at this.
Any closing feelings on this one, before we move on?
I think Blue Spring is kind of, to me, kind of feels like a continuation of a lot of, like... kind of angsty punk cinema of like the 70s and the 80s, but I think he does a really good job, like we kind of said, of kind of also breaking away from some expectations and kind of playing with it, and does kind of a refresh of that genre that I think is really refreshing, fun watch and an approachable film as well, I think.
I like that you've talked about the delinquency theme in terms of genre, because the first thing I thought when I realised what this film was going to be about is it feels like forever since I've seen a film about juvenile delinquents. And I don't know, maybe modern teenagers are just slightly too nice for this thing to work, but watching this did make me think, oh yeah, this is one of those essential good movie subjects, isn't it? And it always has been.
Yeah, and I think they work so well in Japan as well, because like I said before, like we have that, you know, I don't know how true it is, but that expectation of Japanese school life and stuff, and I guess lots of East Asia as a whole just being a very like strict system and stuff, so seeing that kind of rebellion I think is always kind of like interesting.
Beyond what you two have said, really, I just sort of the very laid back tone that's sort of scattered throughout it. It's the most, well, I hate to use the same word, but flu brain is making me say this. The laid-back rebellion and the laid-back satire, like little scenes throughout, the way they decide who's going to be the gang leader. There's a scene later on where Yakuza turns up at the gate and says, okay, so do you fancy joining an Yakuza? You go, I go on then, may as well. It's, when you think of delinquent movies, you think of very aggressive, fighty movies. And this just isn't. And I think it really helps it stand out in a weird little subgenre.
Yeah, it's like a pleasant, aggressive movie.
Yes.
Isn't that many things you can say that about?
No.
Of course, he does aggressive later, but we'll get to that eventually. So, that's film number 1 out of the way. I guess we will be picking what we'll be doing next. So this will be falling onto Patreon, which will eventually make itself onto this feed, but if you want it now, there will be a link in the description about where you can subscribe.
We interrupt this presentation with the following urgent message.
Tonight, America is in grave danger. We are under alien attack by a popular dessert known as the Stuff.
Here, Jason, take some.
No, don't eat that. There is something alive in there.
Tasty!
There's something alive in yogurt. It's called benign bacteria.
If the stuff is in your house, do not eat it. If you have it on your shelves, do not sell it. If you distribute this material, close your doors, make no more sales.
Enough. It's never enough.
Random number generator, Graham. We need that, don't we?
Rob, there are 402 directors on this list, which, what the heck box? That's the state we're at now.
A few people. Right.
Yes.
So, random number generator picked number 114. That's 114.
114 is... Oh, we're back in cult horror territory. This is Larry Cohen.
Okay.
Which I think is jolly interesting, because I'm aware of Larry Cohen as this kind of titan of the B-movies, but I don't think I've seen that much of his actual work.
God Told Me To is outstanding.
That's got Andy Kaufman in, hasn't it? That's a pretty exciting bit of casting,
It's a sort of Videodrome space Jesus. It's a weird movie. But he was known as a very, very interesting person, sort of a great... he came up with great ideas, essentially.
Yeah. Didn't he do Born with Yaphet Kotto?
Did, yeah. You're one of these people who...
I think it would be...
Sorry, go on, Graham.
I think it would be nice to watch that, just because we lost Yaphet Kotto recently and he is still such an underrated actor.
He is. He was also one of these people who worked outside of the studio system completely, and anybody like that has the right amount of punk energy, I think.
Yeah, respect is absolutely due. I'm excited by that.
肥満した世の中の仕組みに守られ、のうのうと生きる奴ら。いつだって正しい声は通らず、 奴らが笑い続ける。暴力で脅すやつ。
こんなに死にたいか。
のひらを返すやつ。父親面するやつ。友達面するやつ。
Let's just jump straight into the second movie of the day, which is his much later film from 2011 or 2012 if you believe Asian Wiki, Monsters Club.
This is one of the ones that was in the box set we got, isn't it? So I suppose I want to start with, Rob, what were your feelings when you watched this as part of that full retrospective?
Well, there's a very large divide between him as a director of very, stylistically broad genre movies, but experimental, and movies which just go full bore experimental. And the first of that box set was Hanging Garden, which is a very, very interesting movie. It's basically the falling apart of a family system, but done in a weird way.
Yeah.
And then you get this, which it's like 80 minutes all in, and it's just completely experimental. It's such a weird little thing.
I think this was the first one I watched for the show. I saw this before I saw Blue Spring, and I remember thinking, even though it was the first Toyoda I'd seen, I remember thinking this is probably his equivalent of what Steven Soderbergh calls a purification project, where no matter what level of filmmaking you work at, eventually you just have to go and make something tiny with a few friends and a camcorder in order to stay focused on the actual craft. And then I watched Blue Spring and I thought, yeah, this is definitely a smaller movie, but I still really liked it. I think this is a really interesting film.
So, how would you describe this one?
Well, I'm really sorry that after we had an episode featuring a film about Jack the Ripper, that we're going back to another true crime case that I am an absolute bore about. But the protagonist in this is basically like a Japanese version of Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber. He lives in an isolated cabin. He has a deep resentment against modern society. He sends bombs out to institutions that he thinks are particularly guilty of propagating that society he hates. And unlike Theodore Kaczynski, he is haunted by ghosts.
Yeah, the way it sets up those ghosts is a bit weird, isn't it?
It certainly is.
Yeah.
Most of them are people, but one of them, what's his name again? Here we have it, Yosuke Kobuzuka. Yeah, he's basically got a load of ice on his face, or shaving cream, or something in between.
Yeah, like a weird clown as well.
I did think where there is a long scene of someone putting that makeup on, and I thought, this is Toyoda inventing that meme of the person putting clown makeup on, and his opinions get stupider and stupider as you go down the list. This is groundbreaking stuff.
Yeah.
So, what are our feelings on this one? I feel you've sort of loaded your pistol a bit early there, Graham, so... I
maybe have, yeah.
Do you want to go first, Graham? Because I know that you said, well, this was the first one you experienced, so...
It was, yeah, and I mean, I have a love for films that are set in the wilderness, and I often find it fascinating when a film is set in one very small location, which, I mean, it can go hideously wrong, but it's always an interesting test. And I did find this a really strong, interesting film. I think the slowness of it at certain points is really interesting. You know, for all Toyoda has that image as a sort of punk director, and you can still see that a bit in here. There are moments like that scene of applying makeup where he just holds for longer than you think is possible, and it's really magnetic. It's really hard to get a sense of how the film is developing, and that's, I think, what keeps it gripping.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, it's kind of, I think as well, for me, rewatching these for this, it was kind of an interesting companion piece to Blue Spring. Kind of felt like this character could easily be the grown-up version of one of the school kids from Blue Spring.
That's a good point.
I watched
actually.
it
Yeah,
after
that's very
it, and it was
true.
kind of like, yeah, it does just feel like kind of this. Life has just done everything wrong for this person, and now they don't have a care, and they just want to see it burn to some degree. And I think he does such a good job of just focusing on these characters that are just on the fringe of society, but not like glamorizing them, actually like spending time with them and kind of like allowing the scenes, like you said, to kind of like play out. And they're just really good character studies. I think he does that really well in this. I think this one's more like heavy-handed in what it wants to say than something like Blue Spring, like with its themes. Like essentially the whole film just has a narration of saying like kind of these Marxist ideas about like capitalism and society and all that kind of stuff. So it's like slightly more heavy-handed, but it kind of works because then it's in this like really just isolated kind of setting, which I think works for it in its favour.
And he's not a wholly reliable narrator, is he? I think it's an effective film in that you can watch it and agree with everything he says and the film works, or you can watch it and disagree with everything he says, and I think that wouldn't change the film very much at all. I think it would still work on the same dramatic level.
Yeah, I think like he slowly becomes even more unreliable, doesn't he? And then obviously like that isolated factor and stuff, it's kind of like, is this just the ramblings of a madman, or is there some substance to this, or and then you start seeing ghosts and stuff, and you're like, maybe it is just the ramblings of a madman.
Yes. But it's interesting in looking at it in terms of how I became aware of it, which was that connection with the Unabomber case. It's interesting what Toyoda jettisons from that story. Like, obviously he sets it in Japan, and obviously he introduces ghosts, but that's almost minor compared with the fact that the thing that attracted the most attention when the Unabomber was at large was that he had this very carefully thought through manifesto and philosophy against industrialisation and against that kind of, not just capitalism, but the whole idea of an industrially advanced society that wasn't based around localism and growing your own produce and things like that. And that's not there in this. And I don't think that's a problem, because it makes the character more of a kind of existential protagonist. You don't need to know anything other than he hates the world and he wants revenge on it, and that's his condition. He becomes almost like a kind of Paul Schrader character because of it.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting as well, because then when you learn like his backstory and stuff, it's like, well, of course he kind of just hates the world to some degree. Like, everything's been taken from him. I think that's really interesting as well, because then at the end, obviously his downfall is still his family, because his sister is the one that kind of like phones him in. so everything, his downfall has been, it's just the falling apart of his family, but he's taken it out on society, which I think is kind of like an interesting kind of character development.
Definitely.
It's an odd comparison, but I felt a lot of Christmas Carol when I was watching it.
That's good. I like that.
Kind of makes sense, yeah.
Yeah.
Because he's essentially a horrible misanthrope who's visited from ghosts from his past and learns the error of his ways.
They're interesting ghosts too, aren't they? They're done using very simple makeup, but they're still effective. They still have a strangeness about them.
I think it helps as well with like the setting. It's just such an isolated setting, and then just the thought of like, that kind of, it's almost like a weird horror movie, but it's not. But it takes a lot of those like tropes, like the one that's just sat there eating. Like it's clearly like he's influenced by a horror film, but he doesn't want to make a straight out horror film kind of thing. I think it's really interesting.
And it goes back almost to like classical Japanese cinema, very old Japanese cinema, things like A Page of Madness or some of Kurosawa's films, where they're done with these very theatrical techniques and makeup where you can see it's makeup, and that's the point. It's not about a complete illusion. There's still a theatre element in it.
Which is really interesting. Is that, well, then when he like places the makeup on himself, and that kind of like embodiment in that final scene, and then obviously like him just walking around the streets in the makeup and stuff, I think is kind of like a really interesting. I don't know what it says, but I liked it.
I do fear that if this Third Window box set sells, that will become an inescapable meme. Just that guy putting the makeup on.
It is, very similar. So,
yeah.
It's a hard first film, though, I've got to say, Graham. Sort of as an introduction to any new director, this is quite an abstract jumping-in point, isn't it?
I mean, from what I've seen, if I had to pick one of the two films that we've seen as a jumping-in point, I would say that Blue Spring is more accessible, definitely. But counterpoint, Rob, you know the shit I like.
Yes, I do. So fair enough. I was a bit taken aback by it, really, because it's one of these movies where it doesn't really set its stall out as it opens. As it opens, you think it's his difficult artistic phase movie because of its slowness, because of its isolation, because it's not one character not talking. It's classic art house affair. But as the film unfolds, as the film expands, I have this problem often when you talk about slow burn films. They're not really a slow burn because a slow burn has to build to something. Yeah. I think this is one of the few examples, really, where that slow burn is actually validated and it works its way to something, rather than just being,
I agree.
Movies are slow because that's arty and that's what arty movies do, and it's kind of very narrow way to look at things, but Toyoda manages it here, I think, quite nicely.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, yeah.
I think one of the things that rescues it from being that kind of self-parodic art house slowness that was kind of everywhere in the 2000s is the fact that the construction of it's not straightforwardly, it is slow and then it builds to something. The beginning is actually quite sort of quick-paced. There's a lot of voiceover, a lot of inserts, a lot of montage. There's no sense that this is aiming for that kind of, oh boy, if we do a 7-minute shot here, we might get into Cannes kind of appreciation. Some of the slowest parts in it actually reminded me of what Steve McQueen sometimes does, where in the context of a drama like, say, Mangrove, he will suddenly hold on one thing, like Sean Parks beating at the cell door, for a really unusual length of time. And the slowness becomes exciting then, because it's not used to kind of deaden you. It's not used as a consistent slow approach. It's almost a kind of bravura slowness. It's saying, all right, I'm going to slow this right down here and you're going to stay with me. And I love that kind of showmanship.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, I think it's a slow film, but it's also not. It kind of like works in its favour in that isolation and stuff, but the actual like character development of him stuff, it happens quite fast, really. Like he goes down this downward spiral in a pretty sharpish nature.
Yeah, I don't think it'd work any other way, really, because the slowness allows you to get into the character's head.
Yeah.
You understand his circumstance, you understand his angst, his anger with the world, really. And yeah, it does have little stylistic flourishes, which I think work, really. It helps expand this beyond one of these movies where it could all be sort of the mania of the lead character. Where is it real, isn't it real? It does enough to mix up the circumstances, mix up the locations, so it keeps everything fresh.
And I think the other thing is, as well as you rightly say, getting into the character's head, it gets into the landscape's head in a way as well, because there were moments where I saw the landscape and I thought that is really beautiful, that's really picturesque, and there were moments when you see it and you think, oh god, it's so remote, it's so oppressive, I'd hate to be lost there. I think it allows the landscape to mean several things, and a quicker film, a more plot-driven film, would struggle to include that as effectively.
Yeah, I think the setting's definitely like a character in it. There's loads of scenes, like you said, where he kind of like lingers on it. The one that really stuck out to me was the one where he's just killed the deer. He's just kind of like dragging it, and it's like this, almost looks like a Christmas card, like the way the trees all go down towards like the centre and stuff. But at the same time, he's dragging this half-dead animal like through the snow and stuff, and it's like this contrast of like beauty and like death as well at the same time that I think like is really interesting.
Feels like quite a good metaphor, that, doesn't it? Dragging a dead deer. It's kind of like flogging a dead horse.
It's such a beautiful gothic Christmas card of a movie.
Yeah. I think what's interesting about this, similar to Blue Spring as well, is that kind of like going against your expectations. Like if you just read the synopsis for this film, you know, about someone who's mailing bombs and destroying people, buildings, everything like that. But it's not. You never see any of that. You never really see any of the violence that he's causing. You just spend an hour in a hut with this guy, and even though the actual like his narrative and what he's doing is this big kind of like could be a big genre piece, you know, big murder mystery thing, but you just spend some time in a hut with him, which I think is really interesting. Similar to something like Blue Spring, you expect all this violence and rise to the top of a gang narrative, but you just kind of get these characters that don't really do any of that, you know.
The closest you get of violence is one of the first scenes where the bomb opens and it's got a voiceover of some politician and his assistant.
Yeah.
And the realisation that it's a bomb, and then it just cuts back to him cutting wood.
Yeah. And all we really see is just the slight insides of the bomb, and that's it. It hides the rest. And even at the end, like when he drops to the floor like screaming, it's like, is he about to let off a bomb? Is like what, you know, like, but it just cuts, you know.
Yeah, it's really tastefully edited.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic scene, that bomb scene, and it really lodged in my head after I saw it because it happens so early and it really puts you inside the protagonist's worldview, where you know that if you saw that story in a newspaper, it would be treated as a sort of terrorist outrage, but for him, it's just a matter of mechanics. That's what he's interested in, just the nuts and bolts of it, literally.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because we only ever see it from his perspective, so I guess that's why we don't ever see the explosions and stuff. Because, you know, he just mails it out and that's it done, and that's all we ever get.
The closest we get is a few policemen turn up in his cabin and chase him.
Yeah.
But that's it.
But they're not very good at running through the snow, so...
Yes.
So, any closing thoughts on Monsters Club?
I think I've said my piece. I found it a really fascinating film that uses very limited means to its advantage. Every limitation feels like something that is absolutely right for this story.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, I think it's a more mature film from him. He definitely shows like progression as a director, which I like. It definitely feels very different to like Blue Spring, but I think underneath it's kind of like the same thing, deals with a lot of the same characters on the fringe, like we said, goes against kind of genre expectations, but yeah, his kind of approach I think is a little more mature, and I think that's interesting to watch that like development.
It's really interesting as well, sort of where it falls in his career. Around this time, he got in trouble with the police, either over gun possession or drug possession. I can't remember which one.
I think he's been in trouble like a few times. I know one of them was just for weed, which is obviously like, it's in Japan. It's like you get in serious trouble for it. So yeah, he's had a few run-ins.
The other one was owning an antique pistol, which didn't actually fire, but they were cracking down on gun ownership. So. You know.
I mean, that feels like something that would happen in Monsters Club.
Yeah.
But essentially, this is nobody's giving me any money, so I'm just going to go out and make something.
Yeah.
And it has that vibe running through all of it, and considering what some other people have done when they've had that sort of creative freedom, I think you take some really big risks, stylistically, storytelling, as well as it just not being a very... I don't mean this in a negative sense, but I think it's more... He's not trying to make a digestible film.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the maturity Robert was talking about, that confidence to say, you know what, I don't mind that not everyone's going to get this, that's fine.
Because I do remember the critical reception of this. This wasn't particularly well liked upon release.
Wasn't it?
You know, because I think it was marketed largely as, well, within the horror circles.
And
that's just not really what it is.
I think a lot of his films, though, like you look at the kind of like So the first time I watched Blue Spring, like the way it was advertised was I thought I was going to be watching school gangs beating the crap out of each other for an hour and a half, hyper violence, Takashi Miike style, Crow Zero kind of film. And then it was, like we said, it was just kind of this almost slow, no one really cares about anything, nihilistic film. But the way it was put out is this hyper violent school kids, and it's not really that.
Yeah, I think that is perhaps a victim of what we were talking about earlier, which is the way Japanese films tend to be marketed in the West, which is that we have always expected a certain degree of transgression and outrageousness from Japanese filmmakers. And I think Blue Spring, even though it's got a lot of other things going on, I think you could probably market that as a violent teen gang film and you could just about get away with it, but you can't market Monsters Club as a horror film. Come on.
They did, unfortunately. I mean, you kind of segued rather nicely there into sort of feelings on Toshiaki Toyoda after these two movies, in general.
I mean, I can go first because I'm like the green one here. I had no real knowledge of him going into this. And in a strange way, I feel like I have no knowledge going out, but in an exciting way. Like, if looking at those two films, if you asked me, what do I expect from this director next, I would have no idea. I think the kind of pure cinema approach of something like Blue Spring, with its almost kind of almost like Fellini-esque approach to this very violent, sordid story, is a world away from the sort of eerie minimalism of something like Monsters Club. So I'm really fascinated to see some of the things he's done, but the only thing that I feel like I know is that I shouldn't expect them to go in any particular direction, because he seems to be full of surprises.
Yeah, I think that's a good analysis. Yeah, I think for me, like, he kind of represents like a continuation of a lot of filmmakers that I really like from like the 80s and stuff, and he kind of seems to take a lot of that spirit forward into like the modern day, because he's obviously still making films now, and he feels in the same club as a lot of directors like Sogo Ishii and stuff, but he's came a lot later. And I think for me, I really like that style of filmmaking, that kind of underground Japanese filmmaking that kind of goes against, feels very countercultural in a place that we personify to be very rigorous and strict on the rules. So I kind of enjoy watching his films and seeing that kind of, you feel like the films themselves are going against the culture. Like, he didn't have permits for half of that stuff in many of the films that he's done, and when they're just running through this, even at the end of Monster Club, like where he's walking through the street, there was probably no permit for that, and it's all done by themselves. And I think it's really interesting. And then obviously himself has had dealings with the war and stuff, so he represents this exciting kind of edge to cinema that I always find really exciting. I think that's the best thing about his films for me.
I mean, I much agree. He's this weird little balancing point. He's incredibly punk, but when you think of punk filmmakers, you think of sort of ferocious, edge of your pants, sort of just anger.
Yeah.
Just go, like Sakamoto, like Ishii. Just angry filmmaking. But he's not that. He's a very, very skilled filmmaker who knows how to put scenes together. He knows how to evoke a mood and atmosphere, as well as building these characters. And above all, he's made a trilogy of films which is basically a giant middle finger to how the Japanese government dealt with COVID. So any movie maker who does that, who's fearless enough in such a rigid system as Japan to do that, I think he's basically got my lifelong adulation.
Yeah, it definitely, it goes against the grain. I don't think he's out there to make friends.
Yeah, the movies, it was Day of Destruction and Go Seppuku Yourself, Wolf's Calling as well, which is a little bit of a weirder thing, but it's like a trilogy. I can't remember what to call it, specific title for the trilogy, but yeah, those movies are kind of Japan, you done screwed up with COVID.
Yeah.
And he doesn't hide it at all.
Definitely, yeah.
So yeah, that's Toshiaki Toyoda.
How does it make you feel when you swallow something?
I just like
the textures in my mouth. It made me feel in control.
I'm right here.
I just wanted to make you happy.
You get back here with my kid!
I did something unexpected today.
Okay, so if you like what we've had to say so far, please do subscribe and give us a rating on your podcast provider of choice, because it helps us stand out in a world of podcasts where everybody has a podcast. Help us stand out from all of that noise. Right, final part of the show. If anybody has anything that they've watched around the sides that they'd like to just talk about for a few minutes, the floor is yours.
Yeah, generally I bring in something that I've watched for a show or for the site, and one thing that I've watched is a kind of extracurricular thing. And I'm kind of excited to talk about my extracurricular thing, not least because it will be embarrassingly out of date by the time this show goes out, so that's good. But I am the last person in the world who watched Denis Villeneuve's Dune a few weeks back. And I really enjoyed that. I have been hot and cold on Villeneuve. I think one of the very first episodes of Cinema Eclectica, back when we used to do that show, was me talking about how much I hated the film Enemy. But some things he's done I've really loved. I think Incendies is great. I think Arrival is great. But I think he has pared back his emotional gearbox a lot since those films. You know, he tends to make films that are single-mindedly about doomy, awestruck kind of moods. But here's the thing. I mean, if you're going to adapt Frank Herbert's Dune, doomy awestruckness is a particularly good talent to have, because that book is all about the doom and the awe. And I think that it's not broken apart, his limitations as a director, but it uses what he can do spectacularly well. I think the world in it feels weighty and genuine in a way that big CGI-driven blockbusters very rarely do. I think he has some lovely performances in it. I think he's finally sold me on Jason Momoa, who has made a career out of appearing in things I could not care less about so far. But who is a great deal of fun and makes a lot of sense in this as Duncan Idaho, the man from House Atreides, who's respected among the people of the desert on Arrakis. I think there's a certain degree of sense that Jason Momoa makes about that is not... I forget who David Lynch cast in that role, but it was probably like someone who went on to have a supporting part in Twin Peaks. Just a guess. But it's very successfully cast. It's 2.5 hours flies by, and I enjoyed it a lot.
I'll probably never see that, to be honest.
I really enjoyed Dune. I thought it was really good. I enjoyed it as well. I didn't expect to. I've never read the books. I wasn't a fan of David Lynch's one, but I thought it was just a great cinematic film that also wasn't too driven by blockbuster spectacle tendencies, and kind of still had some kind of grit and artistic quality to it. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I agree. I think my one major complaint, and it's a complaint that I think Rob will sympathise with, is there really is not enough Dave Bautista in this thing, but I have a feeling that might be remedied in part 2.
I think it will be in part 2. I think he'll play a bigger role, but yeah, I agree with that as well.
I'll jump in next. It's from Second Sight, who I love what they're doing. It won't be the most recent Second Sight movie. I think Censor will be around by the time this is out. It's a movie from 2 years ago, however, time doesn't mean anything anymore. 2019. Called Swallow.
I don't know that one.
It rings a dim bell.
Yeah, from 2019, from director Carlo Mirabella Davis. And it's about a thing which a lot of pregnant women suffer from called pica, which is essentially eating weird stuff, having an appetite to swallow weird stuff. And there's many sequences of this of swallowing like marbles and things that she finds in the carpet after hoovering. So if you're squeamish, probably best avoid this, because it has that David Cronenberg's approach to horror and body horror is the body is terrifying and the things it can do are terrifying, and this does that in a much more mundane way, where something like Pika, which is genuinely real, you hear stories of like women eating like coal when they get like hankerings when they're pregnant. It plays on that sort of thing, but it also is about how the upper classes of America basically treats people as possessions, and it culminates into this weird psychological thriller, really. And it went under a lot of people's radar, and I really, really like what it does and what it says and how it says it. It's rubbed some people up the wrong way, I fear, because it's one of these movies. Apparently, this is like a thing now in the opinions of people who watch movies, where if it's on the nose, it's automatically the worst thing you've ever seen.
Yes, yeah, I have heard that one.
This is that, and I don't think there's another way you could really tell this story. There's a great central performance by Holly Bennett, I think is the name of the lead actress. It's sort of a very big announcement of intent. That's the wrong way of saying it. Sort of a big coming out party as a performance.
Yeah.
And yeah, Swallow, it's definitely one worth checking out. Especially when Second Run have these staggering releases that just have all the extras and just so good.
No, that sounds very good. I saw Hamaguchi's Drive My Car, which is Japan's entry into the Oscars. It's also done really well in most festivals it's already been in. Hamaguchi makes quite long films. This is also quite long, but it's kind of justified, I feel. If you're into kind of, I guess we were talking about it before, but like slow films, does this have, it has quite a big payoff, I think, so it's kind of justified, but just kind of a really in-depth character study of just really interesting characters, and the whole plot is about this kind of he's a theatre director that his wife passes away, and he has a load of tapes still of his wife used to record lines for him to practice, so she would read the other ones, and he goes over these ways in his car, so like even though she's passed away, it's like he kind of continually speaks to her, and this plays alongside kind of like just normal kind of character interactions and slice of life, I guess, interactions, and there's this kind of, the car in the film becomes this kind of like space of intimacy for characters. It's really interesting, kind of the way that it takes this space of just sitting in a car and having a conversation with someone as this kind of therapy, I guess, in a way, and goes and investigates the space of that, and it's a really good film. I hope it does do well at the Oscars for their entry. I think it's deserving, good film, and if anyone can catch it in the cinemas, they should, because it's well worth it.
It's a Haruki Murakami book.
Yeah, it is, yeah. It's a short story as well, so there's definitely... I've not read the original story, but there's definitely been a lot added, I can imagine.
Oh, yeah. The last one, The Burning, I've got to say, I was not a fan, unfortunately. So... Yeah,
it kind of bothered me as well.
So I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah, this is more... It's more of a kind of a... Yeah, just a deep kind of character analysis, I think, and looking at people in certain stages of their life, and particularly like as they're getting a little bit older, kind of middle-aged, that kind of, and dealing with loss and regrets and those kind of things.
Okay, excellent. Graham, did you have anything else?
I don't know if it'll come out yet, but sometime early next year we are doing a Pop Screen episode on Straight to Hell, the film that basically torpedoed Alex Cox's career. And I mean, I can see why, but I found it weirdly fun. It's Alex Cox and all of his rock star mates just playing out their favourite spaghetti western cliches in Spain for about 80 minutes. Complete with a very weird running joke about people becoming addicted to coffee. I guess because he'd just done Sid and Nancy, which is obviously, one of the definitive heroin movies, and he just wanted to make it clear that he wasn't going to be doing that all the time. So yeah, this has all of the Pogues in playing bandits, and they are all suffering from a debilitating coffee addiction. It's very silly, very slight, but I had a fair bit of fun with it.
Graham has segued into something quite nicely there as we wrap the show. Where else we can find the two of you, and what you've been up to?
Indeed, yeah. As said, I run the Geek Show's podcast Pop Screen, dealing with music and musicians in the movies, which you can find on our site. I also, as Rob mentioned at the start, write for Horrified, the British horror website, and The Geek Show, and I am currently finishing work on The Commons, a short film funded by Northern Film and Media, which should be starting to screen in the next couple of months.
Yeah, you can find me on YouTube under my name, Robert Edwards, doing video essays on, I say East Asian cinema, but predominantly it's just Japan and Hong Kong. But eventually we will branch out into South Korea and Thailand, Vietnam, stuff like that. But for now, predominantly we're just focusing on Japan and Hong Kong. Do video essays talking about cult cinema, punk filmmakers, cyberpunk, all that good stuff.
It's definitely worth catching. Sort of the middle point between Ryan Hollinger and accented cinema. So
I'll take that.
A cool guy, very cool guy. So I think that about wraps us up for this episode. Next episode on Patreon. Next episode will be for Larry Cohen. So if you want to get that now, please do check out our Patreon. Otherwise, it will drop on this feed in a bit. Let's just say in a bit. But on this feed, on the free feed, the next episode will be Robert Hamer, in which we cover Kind Hearts and Coronets, and Always Rains on Sunday. So until next time, thank you very much for listening.